Get started. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending the webinar today. My name is Mike Trpkosh. The topic today is going to be ransomware at 10,000 feet, but what we're going to do is use the Colonial pipeline attack to kind of demonstrate several other functions, factors, different things about ransomware, and use it for as kind of our demonstrative tool. So let's go ahead and get started. So a little bit about myself. Again, my name is Mike Trpkosh. I'm the Director of Cybersecurity at Pathway Forensics. Pathway Forensics is a wholly owned subsidiary of Briggs Veselka. Briggs Veselka is the largest independent CPA firm in the Houston area, and they're the third largest in the Southwest. I've been with Pathway Forensics for almost 2 years, and prior to that, I've got about 30 years of IT experience, but the last 15 to 16 have been focused exclusively on cybersecurity risk and compliance. I've been the CISO of a Fortune 100 healthcare company, but I've also been a cybersecurity consultant. And I feel like that gives me a fairly unique perspective on the cybersecurity space. So let's get some definitions out of the way. What is ransomware and big game hunting? So ransomware is malware, malicious software. That's what malware means, that encrypts a victim's their entire machine or their entire network. And then the attacker will demand a ransom. And if you're not given that ransom, then your data network stays encrypted. You're paying for the decryption tool. You're not paying for any silver bullet that's going to automatically make everything whole again. And in fact, often it doesn't. And we're going to see that down the road here. So what is big game hunting? Big game hunting is kind of an extension or a maturation of ransomware. So let me give you a brief history. When ransomware first came out, it started back in actually the 1980s, and it was done through medical research. It was an email that your machine was locked and you had to send the money to this address. It was a PO box, and of course people would send checks and cash and stuff, and of course the criminal was easily apprehended. But what big game hunting has done is taken the evolution of ransomware, where people didn't have backups. They quickly learned, if I have good backups of my machine and my network, then I can just restore from a point prior to the detonation of the ransomware. Well, the criminals then, they reacted by accessing your network or your computer, and they dig through it and they look around for a little while and they find what they consider the crown jewels, whether it's personal data, whether it's intellectual property. There's all kinds of different things that they would find, and they will offload that. And so now what you have is, not only is your network encrypted, but they're threatening to release this information to the public if you don't pay. So they're trying to incentivize you to pay the ransom. Most of the time, they'll spend a week is all they need. And that's what we found through studies of previous ransomware victims, but they can stay in there for months at a time, depending on the size of the organization. So the different types of extortion models that a ransomware group uses is, we have single. That's the traditional ransomware that it just spreads like wildfire through your machine or your network. And if you have good backups, you can restore. All they do is they'll ask you for money and you can tell them yes or no. Double is what we just talked about, the big game hunting. And big game hunting covers all forms of extortion going forward, the double, the triple, and there's even a quadruple, but it's not very widely used right now. But the double is, instead of just encrypting your files, they also take some of your data and they threaten to turn it loose on the internet. And then triple, this is fairly new, but it's being widely used right now. And so they exfil the data after they encrypt everything, or they exfil the data and then they encrypt everything. They tell you, we have your data, and to incentivize you to pay, they'll contact your customers. Or in the case of a medical institution, they contacted the patients and said, hey, we've ransomed your hospital's data, and they're not going to pay us. And so we're going to release all of your personal information to the public. Or a company, they'll reach out to their clients and say, all of the information that you trusted this organization with, they're not going to pay us. And so we're going to release that to the public. And so now the organizations or the individuals, they're getting pressure from their clients or patients or whatever to pay the ransom. So everything happens at a very high rate of speed. They want to put you in a position where you have to pay very quickly, because the longer you have to think of a solution or an alternative, the less chance they're going to get paid. So they're trying to pressure you up front. So why is ransomware so popular now? The advent or the adoption of cryptocurrency has ransomware exploding. And it's kind of like I mentioned earlier, the first case where the guy had people send cash and checks to a PO box. They could stop payment on the check. I mean, there's a bunch of things they can do. They can have a credit card reverse the charges. Cryptocurrency is anonymous. And the thing about cryptocurrency is, once a transaction takes place, you can't pull it back. Whether it's a public ledger or a private ledger, there's no bringing it back. And so that has really caused computer crimes to increase, but mainly ransomware. And so cryptocurrencies are basically, right now, they're the kind of the Wild West of monetary systems. They're assetless, and they use a form of processing called blockchain. Now, in a popular sense, that's very good for people because everybody can see these transactions. They're very difficult to trace. I've actually sat down and traced some. It's just very boring, but you can trace it. It's complicated, and the criminals know how to use that to their advantage. They use the equivalent of like shell companies, and they're moving money back and forth across different wallets. They'll create a wallet, they'll move money in there, and then they'll kill the wallet. And so they're trying to obfuscate their path where they're finally getting rid of the money. Also, once they convert it to regular currency, they have to pull it out somewhere. There'll be a record of that once it hits the regular banking systems. So they'll break it up into smaller pieces to where it's not noticed. I mean, there's tons of tactics, and that's a whole separate webinar. Remote workforce. Global pandemic forced organizations to hastily create almost an entirely remote workforce. And many organizations were ill prepared. They didn't even know what multi-factor authentication was, or they didn't know how to implement it properly. And the criminals know this. And so it's a target-rich environment for them. There's targets everywhere. Organizations may think that they're locked down, and they're wide open to somebody that has the skill and basically just the knowledge to know what they're looking for. The surge in cloud migration. Everybody talks about the cloud. Now, like I say right here, migration to the cloud is a great thing on paper, but in reality, it's a very complicated move that organizations should take very seriously. They should hire professionals if they don't have the skill in-house to map out and move that. One of the biggest issues with cloud migration is access control. The cloud allows you to have a huge number of people access your assets. And if that access is uncontrolled, somebody's going to figure out a way to take advantage of it. So the other thing, a lot of people say, well, the cloud provider, AWS or Microsoft, they were hacked. They've never been hacked. Their clouds. You as an organization or as an individual, you're the one that got hacked. Okay, so when they sell you space, It's kind of like a storage space. If you rent a storage unit and put all of your valuables in there and you walk away without putting a lock on it, it's not the storage facility's problem, it's yours. You didn't put a lock on your door. And that's very simplified, but think of it that way, that if your configuration is incorrect, they just provide you with the tools and the platform. It's up to you to make sure you use them wisely. So what are the costs to businesses when ransomware hits? So FedEx in 2017, they reported losses of $300 million as a result of NotPetya. Interesting ransomware, but well beyond the scope of today's discussion, but maybe we'll do one on NotPetya and WannaCry in the future. Those were very, very interesting. City of Atlanta, they reportedly spent $2.6 million to recover from the ransomware attack in 2018. And here's a side note on that one. The attackers only asked for $65,000, but Atlanta decided to dig their heels in, and huge mistake. They didn't understand their environment. They didn't know what their capabilities were to restore. And so while you have to admire them for taking that stance of not rewarding criminals, it was a foolish, foolish decision. City of Baltimore, it's the same vein, much greater result. They spent $18 million, and they reportedly it cost several city officials their jobs because they ended up having to raise taxes in order to pay for the loss and what it cost them to rebuild their IT systems. Baltimore was what was a dumpster fire. Cognizant Technologies, many people don't know them, but they're a big IT technology solutions company, global, and they were forced to reduce earnings after a ransomware attack in 2020. Notable attacks just in this year. So Colonial Pipeline, which we're going to start delving into right after this slide. JBS happened right after Colonial Pipeline. And this was the DarkSide Ransomware as a Service group was responsible for Colonial, but JBS, some people might have heard of the Revil gang. It's ransomware evil, so it's Revil. But they asked for 22 million and negotiated to 11. Very similar situations, and you'll see why as we get more into this. So Washington, this one is actually the one that really makes you feel bad. They attacked, the Revil gang attacked Washington, D.C. Metro Police. They asked for $4 million. The police said, no, we're not paying you anything. And so they didn't threaten to release information. They did release it. But what the police didn't know was that they had clinical and psychological profiles on their people. They had confidential informant information. I mean, they didn't understand the depth at which these attackers had exfilled their data. And so when they released it, I'm sure they wanted a do-over on that decision. Brenntag is they're a huge chemical distribution company in Germany, and they were attacked by DarkSide right after Colonial. And notice the demand was identical. Difference is Colonial got a lot of theirs back, Brenntag did not. And for anyone in Houston, the Houston Rockets, they were attacked by the Baboot gang. And they had a demand. Nobody knows what it was. And they said that they had 500 gigabytes of information of their athletes and organization, and they threatened to release it. This one's been very quiet. This happened back in, I think, May. And I look to see what happens here pretty regularly, and there's nothing. So that might have been part of the negotiation, is keep it under wraps. I'm not sure. Okay, so now let's start talking about the Colonial attack, and we'll start at the beginning. So what is DarkSide? So a lot of people think that DarkSide is a gang. It's the name of this gang that attacks people, but it's really not. DarkSide is what we call ransomware as a service. So it's a cloud-based tool, and you have a group of developers And what they do is every person that leases this software or uses it gets part of the proceeds. The developers get a piece of the loot, so to speak. And the thing that's interesting about DarkSide is they're an organization. I mean, their ecosystem consists of the hackers, customer support, content development, and receivables. And what I mean by that is you've got the hackers that developed the actual software, but then you have a group of target assessors, and all they do is they go out and they exploit and look for targets. They do scans on the networks. They find someone that's vulnerable, and then they tell, they'll say, we want to rent your ransomware and we're going to deploy it. And then you've got customer support. So the people that attacked you are not the people that you will negotiate with. There's a whole organization that's all they do. And sometimes they support multiple ransomware groups. It's like a call center, so to speak. Content development, how can we improve our ransom? They got a whole development crew. On the dark web, I was looking at some, there were job applications. They were looking for developers. This was a while back, but they wanted people to go out and help them develop this stuff. Now, of course, there's the interview process, and it's very in depth. You have to demonstrate you've done this before, and they vet you, and there's a whole bunch of things. And then receivables, the people that ask you for the ransom, the people that will negotiate with you, they're not the same people that you would talk to about getting the key and how to use the key and stuff. So, I mean, it's a complete organizational structure. The DarkSide actors or the group refers to the criminals deploying the ransomware and targeting organizations. So when you hear DarkSide actors, you're not talking about anybody else in that ecosystem other than the people that are in charge of deploying and detonating that ransomware. And they use 96% of all ransomware attacks last year involved social engineering. And 90% of those were phishing emails. So phishing emails, that's your biggest vector that they use. You'll see that isn't what happened here at Colonial, but also remote desktops or virtual desktop infrastructures, VDIs. You might hear that term. They're interchangeable with remote desktop. So the first instance of DarkSide ransomware appears to have been in November 2020. That's what most people think, but research indicates that threat actors deploying DarkSide, they have signatures that can be traced back to 2019. So what that means is that there was probably a couple guys that developed DarkSide, and these are Russian guys. That's very well known. But they developed it and they deployed it a couple of times on their own, but then they realized the potential it had as an entire ecosystem. So a couple people that joined them knew how to scale and expand, and that's when DarkSide became a cloud platform instead of just an individual attack software. So here's a funny note here at the bottom. So these guys, this group, they engage purely for commercial gain, and they're very open about it. They're not nation state attackers. They don't have political agendas. They're not hacktivists for a cause. They just want money. Now, they publicly stated that they had a code of conduct prohibiting attacks on hospitals and schools. And the other thing was funeral homes. I guess people in their time of grief, they felt bad about that. It sounds good, but they've demonstrated that is not really, they'll attack anybody. They did try to make some charitable donations, and some of the journalists found out about it, contacted the companies that had received that money, and they gave it back. So they'll tell you that, but that isn't who they are at all. Don't feel sorry for them. Okay, so now let's go specifically to Colonial. So how did they get in there? Oftentimes, it's Occam's razor. The simplest solution is often the solution. And that's what happened here. It wasn't some big hack. It wasn't a multi-pronged attack with obfuscation and stuff. This was very simple. Take a step back here. When data is breached and an attacker takes a bunch of your data, what they do is they'll put it out in what they call paste bins, or they'll put it out on the dark web, and they call them leaks. And a leak is a culmination of hundreds of data breaches. And what they have in there is email addresses and hashes for passwords. And a hash is basically just an encryption of your password. They don't know that your password is BlueDog21. They just know that it's this string of characters. And if you change anything in it, it changes that string of characters. So that's what a hash is. It's just an encryption method. So anyway, what happens is these attackers, they go out and they troll these leaks. And what they'll do is they engage in what's called credential stuffing. They'll have a script, an automated script that might have 1,000 websites on it. And they will go out and try to log in with this email address and this hash to every one of them. It's automated. These guys aren't sitting there typing in an email or a website address. They just run this script and it'll run through 1,000 in seconds or less. And then if they get a hit, they move you over into the exploitable pile, and everyone else is kind of throwaways. Okay, we didn't find anything. But these websites are your social networks like Facebook, like Instagram, like Pinterest, like banks, like retirements, just everything. And this is global. This isn't just like in your hometown or in the United States even. I see here that we have our first polling question. So were you familiar with ransomware concepts before joining this webinar? So if you could quickly answer that for us, we'll get back to the discussion. I'm going to grab a drink real quick. Okay, if you're still thinking about it, think about it, we'll move on. So as part of these leaks, we know that they run these through thousands of different websites. Well, they found one that worked. And so then when they find one that's exploitable, they'll use it for all of their targets too. Not only will they try to steal your identity, but then they'll put you in the bucket as, hey, this guy uses the same password across multiple websites. And I can't see you, but I can tell there's a lot of people that their eyebrows just raised or something. And they're like, man, I use the same password across my ecosystem. Very, very bad practice. But anyway, so that's how they got into Colonials. They found that there was, they found Colonial had remote access turned on, and they used, through this credential stuffing, they found out that this person used to work at Colonial. They had an email address. And so then they said, well, heck, let's try this email and password. And it worked. They got in. They were into Colonial's network. So what it was they had a former employee. The guy didn't even work there anymore. The person didn't. But their processes for terminating or removing access were not stellar. In a previous audit, the auditor said that they had a terrible security profile and defensive position, but their processes were not up to speed. And so these accounts, while the person left the company, these remote accesses were still just waiting for somebody to log in. And so that's what these attackers did. Once they got in, they realized what they had. They didn't go into what we call the industrial control systems, which would have been like the control systems of the valves. Now, we found that out later. But at first, we didn't know, we as a security community, as Colonial Pipeline, we had no idea what they had access to. And you can't make an assumption at that point, not with the scale of what Colonial does. So we know attackers are in there. What are we going to do? So again, there was no multi-factor authentication, which would have killed this attack in its tracks, because for those that don't know, multi-factor authentication is the use of an additional form of authentication. You have your username and password, but then you may have a code. And I'm sure a lot of you now from remote workforce understand what this is. It's either sent to your phone, you have a key fob that you'll read that code off of, or you may have an authenticator app on your smartphone where you just pull it up and it gives you the 6-digit code. So that would have stopped this immediately, but they didn't have that in place. So what are the costs of this attack to date? So it'll be impossible to tell. I'm sure that total will never, it'll be rounded up. I'm sure it's going to be hundreds of millions of dollars. If you think about what happened during this attack, you had utter panic along the East Coast. You had price gouging. I saw people putting gasoline into like trash bags. It was crazy. And the ransomware payment, even though much of it was returned, but then you had the fuel price that went up. You had logistics. They had to make special government exceptions for truckers with permitting in order to move fuel manually rather than through the pipeline. I mean, all of that costs money, the lost productivity, and the subsequent work to restore operations, the overtime costs, the forensic costs to kind of dig through this and figure out what happened. And then brand degradation and reputational damage. Now, while this is normally one of the top costs, it's not really in scope here because they really don't depend on their brand or reputation. They're going to pump fuel regardless. So let's talk about this timeline of events. And this gets kind of interesting, and I'm going to give you kind of my perception or my perspective as we go along here. There's several interesting things that happened. So on the morning, very early, like 5 a.m. on the morning of April 29th, the attackers gained access to Colonial's network through a VPN account. Within a couple of days, they had exfilled data, and the attack was understood or recognized on May 6th when they launched the encryption. They've been in there for like a week, exfilled their data, and then they detonated the ransomware. And that's the term that's used when they kick it off to where it starts encrypting everything. And they had a ransom demand. Now, normally an organization will take time to try to figure out what is going on, and let's contact law enforcement and see what's. May 7th, the next day, before they even publicly disclosed that they'd been breached, they paid the ransom. And they paid it in Bitcoin. Now, remember what I just said. They paid it in Bitcoin because that's gonna be interesting in the next couple of slides. So they paid the ransom. On May 8th, they publicly announced the attack, and then they shut off servers and some pipelines. Again, they had no idea what the access was because there had been no forensics. So they thought that people could turn off and on valves, they could flood storage tanks, they could do all kinds of stuff. They had no idea. So they had no choice but to shut everything down. And on May 9th, they made a second announcement discussing how they planned their restart plan. So this is a contingency plan that they'd had in place for some type of a catastrophic disaster. So now they're executing their crisis management or their contingency plans. So on May 10th, the FBI confirmed DarkSide ransomware was the cause of the attack, and the Colonial released 2 more statements around its restoration. So they've got 2 fronts that they're working on. They're working on one front on who are these people, why do they do this, what do they want? On the other front, they're dealing with the public in the US up to the government levels. That's where the president got involved and reached out to Russia and said, hey, we know it's, once we knew it was DarkSide ransomware, we knew it was Russian affiliated. reaches out to Russian president. And they start having dialogues. So, I mean, May 10th is when things started to really, from the public's perspective, that's when things really started to happen. And on May 11th, federal agencies, they released an advisory kind of telling people what DarkSide was, because there was kind of panic about who are these guys and what are they going to do, and am I a potential victim with my pictures of my dog and kids, or is it just infrastructure like dams, power grid? I mean, they had to kind of nip this in the bud very quickly, because it could have turned into mass panic. And this is also when Colonial talked about the exemptions that they received, trying to reassure the public that, hey, fuel is going to continue to flow. There might be a slight gap, but it isn't shut down. Quit putting it into trash cans and trash bags in your car and hauling it around. That's dangerous. So on May 12th, so now this is basically a week later, Colonial Pipeline restores operations and announces everything's kind of back to normal, and telling people to quit panic buying gasoline. On May 14th, this is a week and a day after the attack was first recognized or first detonated, DarkSide goes dark, and they claim that their website, content distribution platforms, all of their servers, they'd lost money, and everything had been kind of shut down. Now, remember that they were getting a lot of heat from the Russian government. I think the Russian government kind of lets them just play in their own sandbox, and they probably get kickbacks from it. But this was way, way too much publicity. And I think I wouldn't be surprised, I don't know this for a fact, but I wouldn't be surprised if the Russian government said, knock it off, talking to a kid that's acting up. Now, here's a date to remember. Remember I said the 4.4 million in Bitcoin was paid, and on June 7th, the FBI seized 2.3 million in Bitcoin by tracking a wallet and obtaining a private key. So keep that in mind. So the DarkSide decryptor tool, what you pay your ransom to get, it's known to be slow and kind of wonky and error prone. Colonial even confirmed that they weren't able to use the tool and ended up having to rebuild their network through other means. Colonial quickly paid the ransom for access to a tool that they knew had extremely poor record of success of restoring networks and decrypting the ransom, but they paid it anyway. So the speculation continues to intensify that, and it's still to this day, there's chats and stuff you can look at, but Colonial paid the ransom because when they first notified the FBI knew how to get that money back, and they were like, string them along, pay the ransom, and we'll get it back. And they were able to track it. Now, if you remember, I said they paid it in Bitcoin. Bitcoin has a public ledger, meaning anybody can go out there and trace transactions. It's monotonous and it's complicated, but it can be done. And the FBI is getting very good at doing it. But they had a choice. They could have paid in Bitcoin or they could have paid in Monero. Monero is a private ledger and it's truly untraceable. They paid in Bitcoin, even though it had a 10% higher fee. So on 4.4 million, they paid an additional 10% to use Bitcoin. So you got to wonder, why would they do that? Bitcoin utilizes a public blockchain ledger. Monero utilizes a private ledger, making it untraceable. Now, it's possible Colonial paid the premium to use Bitcoin at the request of the FBI, and that they were able to trace the Bitcoin transfers of approximately 63.7 Bitcoins. Now, some of you probably say they asked. We have another question here. If y'all wouldn't mind taking 1 second, I'll get another drink and let y'all answer that for us. All right. So you might remember that they said, okay, they asked for 4.4 million. They got 63.7 Bitcoins. But then the FBI, when they were able to get that money back, they got back less than that. That's because of the currency value of Bitcoin. They got back all the Bitcoins, but the currency had devalued in the time between when they paid it and when they got the money back, got the Bitcoins back. That's why you'll see a discrepancy. So the Bitcoins were transferred to a specific wallet, and they've been tracking these transactions. And the FBI, lo and behold, had a private key. Think of the private key for a Bitcoin wallet like a password. It's a big, long, like 60-some character password for your electronic wallet. And that's how you get into this wallet in order to transfer the money or make payments, whatever. But the FBI also had the key to this electronic wallet, unknown to the criminals. And it's unknown how the FBI came to have the private key, but now we're going to put on our conspiracy hats, and I'm going to tell you about some of the additional research that I've done. And this is going forward. This is me giving you my perception based on facts that I've read and kind of put together. I study these data breaches pretty extensively. So on Tuesday, June 8th, I remember June 8th is the day after the DarkSide went dark, the day after the FBI got the money back from for Colonial Pipeline for the ransom that they paid. This is the next day. The FBI announces that they have had a global sting operation going on for 2 years, and it was called Operation Trojan Shield, or OTS. So OTS began with the secret prosecution of an encrypted services company. Think of like a T-Mobile or a Cricket or something like that. Only this one only dealt in encrypted services. They had a special device like a phone, but it wasn't a phone. You couldn't make calls on it. It was only used for text messages. And it was significantly encrypted, heavy encryption. And it was promoted to criminal organizations like the Sinaloa cartel. And the informants that the FBI used, they promoted these devices because they had shut down this company that was doing this. And then they used their informants to say, no, they're still back online. You know, their devices are good. Keep using them. So now all of a sudden, for 2 years, criminal groups are using these devices to chat back and forth. And so these law enforcement, they're monitoring all this. They own this company. So people think that the service is encrypted, but it's owned by the FBI. And so they duped criminal elements into using what they thought or believed to be an entirely encrypted communication service called ANOM, or Anonymous, unaware it was being monitored by law enforcement. This gives you, the next statement here gives you an idea of the scope and scale of this sting operation. It included 27 million text messages over 2 years from 12,000 different users in 300 criminal groups across more than 100 countries, and it involved, at the peak, 9,000 law enforcement offices around the world. I mean, this thing is massive. Remember, they shut it down and announced publicly, this is what we've just completed, the day after they got the money back for Colonial. The OTS resulted in the seizure of more than 8 tons of cocaine, 22 tons of cannabis, 2 tons of synthetic drugs, 250 firearms, luxury vehicles, and, wait for it, $48 million in various currencies. And I want you to read that as cash and cryptocurrency. So the speculation, and I believe this to be true, is OTS had intercepted communications from someone or several people within the DarkSide ecosystem, And so they had the private key for the money transfers that they were doing for their ransomware. They also had it for their servers. So that's how they were able to shut the servers down, take all the money they had. And that, to me, that's the logical next step. But I think that's how they shut down DarkSide, ransomware as a service. Now, for those of you that are wondering, well, what happened to DarkSide? They went dark for a while. They probably vacationed, and then they came right back, and now they're back in business as under another name. So what are today's takeaways now that we're all educated on what happened at Colonial, how it happened, what all was involved, and Operation Trojan Shield? So what this event and others like it have demonstrated is that everyone is a potential target. And like I said earlier, these criminal groups have teams that some are just dedicated. The newbies are dedicated to individuals. If your grandmother gets her computer ransomed and it has all of her pictures on it, there's one team of these ransomware groups that's all they do is deal with individuals. And they've got it down to a science to where they know how much to ask for, and they also know how to negotiate with individuals. But they also have teams that will deal with SMBs, and they also know by industry, well, here's how much you should be able to pay for your ransom. And then large organizations. Many of you have probably heard of Garmin. Last year, they were attacked. And I think the ransom that they paid, they asked for 20 some million and they ended up paying like 10. But the thing that you have to remember is these are sophisticated crime groups and they know what they're doing. I'll give you another example. I was reading I was reading basically a recount of the negotiations with one company and a ransomware gang. And the company said, we're going to need some time to get the money together. And then they came and they said, okay, we'll give you 72 hours. And then they came back and said, we don't have that kind of money. And the criminal group came back and gave them a bank and an account number and said, look in there and I think you'll see that you have plenty of money. So they know what they're asking for before they ask. So the worst thing you can do is underestimate them and play dumb. They know what the rules are. They know what you have. You just have to deal with it. If you're not prepared, your only option is to pay it or suffer. And you're going to suffer. So, you know, the ransoms demanded are based on research of their target, what they believe to be fair for that size of target. So the next takeaway is pay or don't pay. All right, so that's an age-old question. That's the equivalent of why the chicken crossed the road. And the easy answer is don't reward criminals by paying them. But the hard truth is that by not paying, you could be sealing the fate of your organization. A lot of these organizations, law enforcement has a competing priority with yours. They don't want you to pay. And they're right to feel that way. But you have to consider, what is your data worth to you? Is it worth the livelihoods of all of your employees? Because you're going to have to shut your doors. Several small medical groups in the Midwest, I researched a couple of these. One was an ear, nose, and throat clinic, and the other one was an ophthalmology clinic. Both of them said, we've been down for 2 days. We don't have backups. We can't afford the ransom. And they closed the doors. And those people were all out of work because of it. This was before COVID. So each organization has to make that call. But just remember this. Each case is different. But what is the same is the conversation prior to the event. Have these conversations. Talk with the executives amongst themselves. What do we do if ransom happens, a ransomware attack happens? You need to be prepared. One of the things that I do is we do a ransomware readiness assessment. How well prepared are you to thwart an attack with your backups, with your security awareness training, your phishing campaigns? But then we also do a maturity assessment where we come back in and say, okay, we've looked at how well prepared are you to deal with an attack? and the results are pretty astonishing. Some companies are fairly well, most are not well at all prepared. And the biggest thing is time is your enemy when these things happen. Things have to happen very quickly. And if you don't have a plan in place, what we call a data breach response plan, or DBRP, it outlines, excuse me, it outlines roles that the data breach response team should have. You should be able to say, people, this one's real, but we've exercised this plan several times. It's just another exercise, and let's go. And everybody should keep moving. That's the ultimate situation, but unfortunately that doesn't happen very, very often. And especially if you find yourself as a victim, that is not the time to exercise your plan for the first time.
Hey, Mike, we have a question that came in that I think you can answer as part of your discussion point right now. One of our attendees said, we were targeted a couple of years ago. As soon as we knew we had the problem, we shut our system down. Rather than pay, we wiped our servers and reloaded from our backups. I'm curious why more companies aren't using their backups. Are you able to address that?
Yeah. So great question. And if you remember when I talked about the extortion models, the first one, so first is single extortion. They ask you for money. And if you're in a great position, which obviously this individual was that asked the question, you wipe everything and all your loss is productivity. And you probably lost some data, but not very much. So to counter that, what these criminal groups are doing now is they go in and they take data and they exfiltrate it out of your systems. And so now they not only have encrypted everything that you own, but they also have a lot of data and they threaten to release that to the public. So that's why more companies, it depends on the ransomware demands. If you get kind of a non-technical group or a group that's just in it for the smash and grabs, you can probably do that. If you're attacked by a fairly well-organized criminal group, there's a good chance they were in there long enough to infect your backups. That's one of their tricks as well, as they go in and they take over your backup service account. And so then they infect the backups as well. So you restore from backup and it just redetonates once you get restored. So there's several things you have to consider if you're thinking of doing that. If you don't have cyber insurance, you should have it. But again, you have to think about what is it going to cost based on what it will pay. And one thing I'll tell you about cyber insurance is please write this down if you write down anything. If you're researching cyber insurance, come up with use cases of different scenarios that could happen and talk with your insurance provider about, would this be a valid claim? Quick example, when WannaCry hit, it was actually detonated as an attack from Russia against the Ukraine. And it happened to a Ukraine company, but the software that it attacked was global. And so WannaCry spread around the world. Even a huge shipping company like Maersk was dead in the water. No pun intended. But what the problem was there was everybody tried to file on their insurance. And because they considered that an act of war, Russia versus Ukraine, they denied a lot of claims. Some insurance companies did because they said it was an act of war and that wasn't covered. So do your due diligence if you're going to get insurance. Never consider your insurance a silver bullet. That should be a supplement. It should cover the majority of costs, but you have to understand it's a risk conversation. What can we absorb in order to keep our premiums low and be prepared to have to pay that in the long run? And the final takeaway for everyone in your organization has a part to play and a responsibility to understand the risks of living and doing business in a digital world. The IT team is just one piece of the puzzle. They're not responsible. As a CISO, what I used to tell people in our all hands meetings is I said, every one of you is a part of the cybersecurity team because you are my eyes and ears throughout the organization. I need everyone out there to be resilient and make sure that you follow through on checking your email to make sure it's relevant and accurate and is not some type of spam or scam that's going to get us into trouble. So just remember that everybody has a part to play, as well as a home user. You have to keep if you're going to use technology, you need to understand technology. You don't have to be an expert, but you need to understand the risk of utilizing any type of technology. And so here's here's our last poll question. Everybody take a quick minute to fill that out. I'll get my final drink. And for those of you that are filling that out, think about, like a data breach response plan. Do you have incident response plan? Do you have anything in place? I've included this slide because this comes from US CERT, the United States Computer Emergency Readiness Team, and they have recommendations on protective measures to kind of thwart ransomware infection. Remember, they're talking to the entire country, so some of this stuff may not apply. Some of the stuff you may already be doing, and you'll have to go in and prioritize these to what's most applicable to your organization or to you personally. But these are some good tips that they give you. And everyone will be receiving the deck that attended today. And I'm Mike Trpkosh, and thank you for attending. We'll open it up for questions now.
I don't have any new questions that have come in. We can give it a couple of minutes just in case you guys have any final questions. I did see that a hand was raised. If you're able to type in your question, that would be ideal. I don't know if you raised your hand accidentally, but if you did have a question, please go ahead and type it in that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Oh, here we go. Would you recommend using MFA on every account in the general?
Yes, I do. From a personal standpoint, I use the application on my phone called Authy, and I have probably 15 different ones. Now, some of them you have to weigh the data value to whether or not you want to use MFA. But once you start using MFA, it's just like when you started using passwords. It's kind of a pain in the behind at first, but now it's so commonplace. I think you're going to see MFA become common, and I would, just as good hygiene, I would use MFA on everything. But if you're going to choose not to use it or selectively use it, make sure that you consider the value of the data in the account that you're considering not using MFA.
We have another question. Would we contact your firm, being Pathway Forensics, or Briggs Veselka, to get an analysis of our risk? And Mike, I'm going to drop the free benchmark survey link into the chat box for everyone. We'll also include that in the follow-up email.
Yeah, so you would reach out to Pathway Forensics. You can reach out to me directly, but in recognition of October being Cybersecurity Awareness Month, we're offering a free threat assessment. Actually, it's putting the link in the chat. Everyone can fill that out. What you're going to get is, it's going to take you 2 to 4 minutes to fill it out, but it's going to give me an idea of kind of your defensive posture. And what you'll do is you'll get immediate feedback from my team regarding the answers that you provided. But then I look at each one of these, and I will send you an email that has my thoughts collectively. So you're going to get responses for each question, but I'm going to look at it holistically, and I'm going to say, your defensive position looks good, but here's what you're vulnerable to. You may say no to one question and no to another one. And individually, those aren't a big deal, but when you combine those two, it may significantly increase your risk. And I'll tell you that. But that's free right now that we're offering for October. And when we also have another risk assessment that we do that's a little bit more comprehensive, provides you with a dashboard, strategic roadmap, and basically a listing of all the gaps that we identified.
Mike, I know we only have a couple minutes left. It looks like this is our last question, but I think this is really relevant to a lot of our audience. We are a small business. How concerned should we be that our outsourced IT group is honest and not involved in a cyber attack? How much of a risk is this? So I think that kind of speaks to a lot of these companies that outsource IT and what kind of risks are involved there?
Yeah, so that is a great question. It's a question a lot of people don't consider. They think that once they've outsourced that they own the risk. They own the risk to the point that it's your data that got compromised. I mean, ultimately, you're responsible for your data. If you're a healthcare company and your provider gets breached, it's still a breach of your company. And so you have to consider that. One of the things that you should be doing on a regular basis, if you don't have the technical chops to do it, get somebody that can, but you should review that IT outsource contract every year and make sure it's relevant and accurate. And then you should have metrics in place that allow you to check how well they're doing. I mean, there's several, there's too many to get into with the time we have left, but there's a way that you can set up a dashboard to check the validity of the work that they're doing. But I would recommend anyone that outsources, you should have a mechanism in place to check how well they're doing, and also then be able to speak to, well, if you're not doing it, how does that benefit me? Those are service level agreements or SLAs. I think we're out of time. I really enjoyed the hours I spent with y'all, and I hope y'all have a great rest of your day. And that will conclude our ransomware webinar for today. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.